Welcome to today's talk session. My name is Deidre Moss, and I'm the host of Can We Talk? I'm an educator, motivator, and a talk connoisseur. In our session today, we will focus on social work as March is observed as awareness for social work. So today, I'm so excited. We were having an international session. I'll welcome Miss Manicka Thomas
Hello.
today to talk about her work. So I want to pass the virtual mic to her to have her introduce herself.
Okay, thank you so much, Deidre, for the invite. And yes, as you mentioned, March is National Social Work Month. So all the social workers around the world are being honored and recognized for the work that we do with children, youth, and families. So again, my name is Manicka Thomas. I own and operate a mental health private practice in Ohio, where I work with African-American children, youth, and families impacted by trauma. And when I describe trauma, I describe it as any life experience, any stressful life experience that's either overwhelming, unpredictable, or chronic, meaning it happens over time. So I have a staff of 2 therapists and 1 intern who works here at the practice with me. And we see children and families who are experiencing anxiety, depression, and any trauma-related mental health disorder. I also have a YouTube channel where I educate social workers about becoming a social worker and what the field entails and how to transition from being an employee in social work to being an entrepreneur.
Awesome. And you're doing so much great work with your channel. So that's how I kind of came across you.
Oh, thank you.
And so I know you talked a little bit about yourself, but if you can, just give us a little bit about your background.
Sure. So I graduated with a bachelor's degree in social work. And then after I graduated with my bachelor's, I earned a master's degree in social work. And I didn't really know what I wanted to do with my social work degree. I knew that I liked helping people and I knew that I wanted to help children, but I didn't really know what all that entailed. So I ended up working first at Children's Services. That was my first job out of college. So I worked there, and then I was like, I don't think this is what I want to do. So I started working within an after school program. Then from there, I just did a range of social work positions. So I worked in foster care. I did foster parent training for foster parents who wanted to foster children who were in the child welfare system. And then I taught at the college level. So I taught introduction to social work as well as first year experience courses. And then I worked independently as a therapist before I opened my private practice. So I did family-based therapy. So I'm trained in functional family therapy, which is a model of family therapy to work with children who are in the juvenile justice system. And then I am an EMDR therapist, which is a trauma-based therapy model that works to move the trauma through the body. And EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. So it reprocesses old trauma memories so they're not stored in the body. And then in addition to that, I again have my YouTube channel where I educate social workers around becoming entrepreneurs. And then I, have a family that I, help take care of. My niece is in college. She's going to be graduating soon. So her, and then, taking care of my mom and helping her with the things that she's working on. I'm not really taking care of my mom. She's taking care of herself, but we work together a lot on things that she's doing. So yeah, that's a little about me. I like to roller skate. That's one of the things I like to do in my spare time. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. I mean, and you talked about some heavy stuff. That's some heavy, hitting stuff.
Yeah. Trauma is really impactful to people. I don't think people really realize when you've experienced something within your childhood, how much it impacts you into adulthood. And sometimes we don't really understand why we do the things that we do or why we think the ways that we think. Sometimes we just say, well, that's just the way that I am. But oftentimes we don't account that to the trauma that we may have experienced in our lives that created us to be that way, because trauma has a way of creating adaptive behaviors within you, meaning you find a way to survive when you've experienced a traumatic event. And it doesn't have to be, the natural disaster or loss of a family member or being removed from your home. It can be what we consider small t traumas, which can be being bullied at school or being teased about your body or being laughed at about, a physical feature that you're really self-conscious about. So trauma can show up in a lot of different ways.
It's powerful that you mentioned that, and the fact that persons are living, walking, breathing this stuff, and they don't really realize that some of the reactions that they have kind of may be triggered by some type of childhood trauma. So I want to thank you,
Absolutely.
yeah, for mentioning that, and it speaks to how important your work is. So I
Yeah,
want to
thank
thank you for
you.
sharing that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so you talk about some heavy stuff. So I just wanted to ask you, what is your inspiration? This type of work, I don't think it may be for everyone.
Yeah.
So really, what was your inspiration to really go into this area?
Well, just like a lot of African Americans, I grew up not, with not having a lot. Me, my sister, my mom, and my dad, we lived in a 1-bedroom house when I was growing up. Me and my sister slept on the couch, and my mom and my dad slept in the bedroom. Sometimes we would sleep in the bed with my mom and dad, but that's how we grew up. And from that, you learn how to survive. You learn how to prioritize things that are important to you, and then you also internalize what all that means about you as a child, your worthiness, what you deserve, what you can have access to, and that can sometimes limit your idea to think about what you deserve, or you might want to be more aspirational. And I think for me, based off the way that I grew up, I knew that I wanted more for myself, and I knew that in order for me to have more, that I would need to create certain things for myself. So I knew that I would have to go to school, and that was instilled in me, the importance of going to school, and then that creating avenues to have access to things. And then when I was in school, I always grew up, while I was growing up, I always lived in an African American community. So I was always surrounded by people who looked like me, who talked like me, and who lived like me. And then when my mom and dad separated, that was the first time I lived in a predominantly white area. So that was the first time I ever experienced being called the N-word and people making fun of me and chasing me and my sister home because of, the color of our skin, or they would tease us and pick on us. So that was the first time I experienced that. And it really took a toll on me as a child. And I knew that I never wanted to be in a space where people were treated that way. And I think that's where, my advocacy came from, is I always wanted to advocate for people who were treated poorly, or who were experiencing any types of disadvantages. So because of that, I knew that I wanted to help people. And then when I went to college, I was introduced to social work. I thought I wanted to be a teacher at first. So I knew I wanted to do something to help people. I thought I wanted to do business at one point. So someone suggested to me that I take an introduction to social work and introduction to education course. So that's what I did. And the social work was just a good fit for my personality. It talked about social justice and advocating for the disadvantaged, and understanding systems and how they impact the lives of people. So that really set me on the course to being a social worker. But then the more that I learned about the African American experience, and what we endured in the country because of our historical oppression, that really made me want to focus in on how trauma impacts us as African American people. So then I started a course toward more Afrocentric practices, thinking about how specifically were African Americans treated, how are we targeted, how has this impacted our culture, the way that we raise our children, the way that we identify ourselves, the way that we identify beauty. So I really began a route to think about how that impacts us. And then that's what led me to the work that I'm doing today.
Wow, that's some heavy stuff. That's some heavy stuff. And you talked about, you kind of not, it was not necessarily maybe your first choice. And maybe
Yeah,
you were
no,
thinking about education.
I was. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was thinking about being a teacher. I liked working with children when I was in college. And then I think just from having, a lot of cousins and always loving to be around my family. Like when I used to celebrate Christmas, we would always get together every New Year, every Christmas Eve at my grandmother's. Like that was our family tradition, to get together at her house, and all the kids would come, my aunts, cousins, uncles, everything. So family was always been a big part of my life, spending time with my family. So I think that connectedness is, really what drove me to be able to help families maintain that, because I knew the value that it had in my own life. And thus, I named my practice Kindred Connections Therapy Center, because I knew how important those connections have been for me.
Awesome. Awesome stuff.
Yeah.
And you talk a little bit about your experience and, growing up predominantly in a Black community and
Mm-hmm.
coming out of that experience and maybe finding yourself in a different experience, and, what you would have experienced as a result kind of pushed you more to understanding those social justice themes. And
Yeah.
coming out of the heels of Black History Month, I think it was so important for you to talk about that experience, because we don't often, I don't know if we more or less sweep it under the rug. I mean, I
Mm-hmm.
know we're different cultures, but it's the same thing,
Yeah.
within the community of Black persons.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes maybe it's often swept underneath the rug, but
Yeah.
there's some type of trauma attached to those experiences, and we don't often
Yeah.
talk about that.
Yeah, we don't talk about it or we don't know about it. I don't
Mm.
remember really being educated about what we had
Wow.
experienced as a culture.
Wow.
So yeah, I literally had to unlearn some things that I was
Mm.
taught about who I was, and then I had to relearn
Wow.
what it meant to be African American.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, that's powerful. It's powerful. But thank you for sharing, what would have inspired you to kind
Mm-hmm.
of, take on that field and enter the realm of social work. But not just social work, because I'm learning as well, because sometimes, when I think about social work, I think about, you're helping families, but you're talking about trauma and all of these other things that is attached to it. I'm like, wow,
Yeah,
it's so bigger, it's so much bigger than that.
it
And I
is.
want
And
to
that's
thank you
one of
for
the things,
explaining.
absolutely. And I think that's one of the misconceptions about the social work profession, is that, people sometimes think of it in a very one-dimensional way, that it's the children's services worker working with the family after a child has been abused or neglected. Then the social worker comes in and it removes the child from the
Right.
home. That's only one aspect of what social workers do. And ideally, the goal of social workers is not to remove the child from the home, is to ensure that the child is safe. So if a social worker finds that the home isn't safe, then the goal is to place the child in an environment where they can be safe. But again, that's only one level of social work. Social workers work in hospitals. They work in an actual hospice setting. When family members are dying, they help you make those end of life decisions.
Wow.
Social workers work in schools, on psychiatric units. They're in private practice, like what I'm doing. They work at the governmental level. So it's a lot of different positions where you'll find social workers.
Wow. That's powerful. This is a very important profession, and I'm so glad. It's only 1 month, but I'm so glad that we are actually, have a time where we can really highlight and bring awareness to really what this field is all about. Because, like I said, from someone looking from the outside in, you're just thinking about that person just coming in and, cleaning up a situation, but you're not thinking about all of those areas that is attached to this career. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for explaining. Now you may see me dip my head a little bit. I'm looking through comments. So yeah.
That's okay. Yeah, that's totally fine. And one of the things about the profession that is, if you think of any major transition that you have in your life, that can be the time where you work with the social worker. If you're going through a transition from high school to college and you don't know what you want to do with your life, if you're transitioning from college to career, and you want to know how to navigate your profession, or you're struggling with self-esteem or confidence, if you need access to resources to help you get started within your profession or your career or for your life, if you need to learn certain life skills in general. So any transition that you have in your life could be the time when you could work with a social worker.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah.
And enlightening us.
Yeah.
And so that brings me to the next question as it pertains to social work. I know you about, those other areas, but can you share, any enlighten us a little bit more on really what the field of social work encompasses?
Yeah, sure. So we typically define social work as the helping profession. We describe it as the hand, heart, and head, meaning we use our hands as resources to help people, but we also use our head because there's a certain knowledge base that has to be had in order to know how to help people move through a change process. And then we also talk about the heart, because you have to have a heart for people and a heart for doing the work. So again, it's called the hand, heart, and hands profession. And within that, there are three different levels within social work that we define as the micro level, the meso level, and the macro level. So the micro level of social work is what we call working one-to-one or directly with people. So that would be your children's services workers, your therapists like me working one-to-one. Your meso level of social work is more of your community based. So if you're working as an activist in a community, or if you're working on a political campaign, or you're working in the schools or helping create policies for an after school program or working with an after school program. So that would be more of a community based, group based. That's at the meso level. Then you have the macro level. That's more of like big picture policy level work. So that's more when you're looking at, are policies discriminatory towards groups? Are certain groups being left out because of how policies are written? Are policies negatively impacting one group over another? It's also looking at service provision. So the types of services that are offered to particular groups. So the services that are offered to people with disabilities, for example, or for pregnant women, or for mothers who lost their children. So it's looking at, it can be considered a governmental level or just a very high level view of how different types of social services impact the lives of people. So you can have social workers actually creating policy, advocating for policy at the governmental level. So for example, when you hear conversations around abortion or Planned Parenthood, oftentimes there's a social worker or an advocacy group who sometimes drives that advocacy. So it's not always the case, but you do have certain bills that are introduced by social workers for political reasons that they feel would benefit a disadvantaged group or a group who is oftentimes looked over. Because the goal is to have services be more equitably distributed across communities. So because we know that resources aren't always distributed fairly, meaning some people have more access to resources than others, social workers oftentimes come in to say, how can we make sure that there's more parity? How can we make sure that things are more equitable in terms of who has access to what? It shouldn't just be that people who have a high level of education should have access to certain things. Even people who don't have as much money and resources, they should also have access. So then you'll see a social worker maybe working or advocating for a program to put in place so that a family or an individual would have more access to something that someone with a little bit more money and resources has access to. So that's just a few of the different ways that we work within communities and within government and with individuals at those three different levels.
Thank you. Thank you for explaining that and talking about, the different levels of social workers.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I just want to say that I learned something else today as well, in the fact that, social workers play an important role in driving that conversation around policy.
Absolutely.
I'm learning something new today.
Yeah. Absolutely do. And
Thank
sometimes you will have lobbyist organizations who do that level of work, but oftentimes those decisions aren't made by one person. It's oftentimes some type of coalition or some type of committee or group that comes together to make certain decisions around what policies are needed. Because you have to think about, when policies are created, ideally the goal is for it to positively impact the group who needs it most. So you have to have people who are directly being impacted by the policy change that you wanted to make. So the actual constituency or the client group. And then you want to have the group that's actually working directly with that group, who can speak to the challenges and barriers that they're facing. And then you want to have the decision makers at the table too, the people who can actually implement the change that we know is needed on the ground to help the population that you're working with. So because those decisions are oftentimes made by consensus or in a group, social workers are oftentimes at the table when those decisions are made.
Wow, thank you. So Lynetta Weaver is saying social work is an umbrella all by itself. There's lots of work to be done.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to jump to our next question as it pertains to social work awareness. And why is Social Work Month so important, particularly, as it pertains to recognizing the field of social work?
Well, thank you for that question. I appreciate that. So the reason why is so important, well, let me back up. So we have a national organization called the NASW, which stands for the National Association of Social Workers. So that's our largest body of social workers. But we also have the NABSW, which is the National Association of Black Social Workers. So that is for African-American social workers who really want to target in on the issues that impact the African-American community. But the NASW, the bigger organization, typically creates the theme for the month. So for this March, the theme is "The Time is Right for Social Work." And the reason why that is the NASW is saying that the social work profession is slated to grow by 800,000 new social workers by the year 2030. So that means that we need people in place who are equipped to help manage, understand, help people work through, cope with all of these different social ills that we're experiencing as a community, as a nation, and within the world. Because people are continuing to be sick, dying from different diseases. I won't specifically name the one because I don't know how the monetization and things like that work, but families are still needing to make decisions around childcare. Women are needing to make decisions around pregnancy and abortion. So with all of those life decisions that are made, if you think about, again, any transition in your life, when you're married, when you're having children, when your children are going off to school, when you're nursing, oftentimes there's some type of stress that's related to any transition. And because social workers are trained to know how to help people cope, manage stress, come up with interventions, get access to resources, we're at a prime position where social workers need to be in place to help people through those difficult times, to help them navigate those difficult times. So you don't always have to rely on your family. You don't have to put the burden on yourself and feel like you don't have anyone who you can rely on. That's what social workers were trained to do. Social workers were trained to be able to help you figure things out, to think about everything that you have going on in your life, and to start putting the pieces together. So the reason why it's so important is because people need to know the vast range of skills and knowledge that social workers have to be able to help manage and understand some of these problems. So it doesn't just have to be that, again, a social worker comes in to remove your children. If you just don't know how to cope with being a new mom, or if you are having difficulty understanding your teen's behavior, or if you're stressed out because you feel like you're being misunderstood at your job, those are all things that social workers help with. So any life event that's stressful could be an area where you could use the help of a social worker. And that's why the field is so important, because stress is one of the highest, it was related to the most physical ailments. The more stress that you have, the more likely you are to experience physical ailments in your body. So the more that you are able to learn how to relieve the stress and reduce the stress, the better off it'll be for your mental health and your overall health in general.
Yeah, thank you for enlightening us and mentioning, the important role that social workers play, and also mentioning, that stress is related to a lot of some of the physical it's manifested physically sometimes.
Yes, it
So
is.
thank you. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that's really important for people to understand and know is, if you are experiencing a stress in your life, like we said about a job, if you happen to lose your job, if you're in jeopardy of losing your job, or if your child gets sick and you're experiencing that stressful thing in your life, if you don't have good ways to release that stress hormone is what we call cortisol. Cortisol can sometimes be stored it is stored in your body because it's your stress hormone. And when that cortisol is not released through physical activity, through crying, through talking, it can begin to target different organs in your body. And from that, you can develop fibromyalgia. So fibromyalgia is sometimes considered a stress-related disorder because that cortisol can again attack your organs. You can develop multiple sclerosis, which is sometimes a stress-related disorder. Any heart condition is oftentimes attributed to stress. So if you are someone who has high levels of anxiety, that can be related to stress. So when that cortisol is not being released, that's where you find yourself in jeopardy of those physical symptoms, which can manifest into actual diseases.
Wow. And as you would have mentioned, that's where the social workers come in.
Mm-hmm.
And when we think about the pandemic and what people have been experiencing,
Yes.
it's possible that, if never more than before, we need those persons in place to, kind of help fill in the gap.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And you also talk about, the expectations by, the year 2030.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to have more persons come into the field, but
Yeah.
on the flip side of that, are we getting persons who really have that love? I mean, because this is a field, like I said, is not for everyone. And,
Yeah.
is the heart really there? Because you're really dealing with that. The heart matters. You're dealing with people.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. And you do have to have a passion for helping people. And it can be heavy work. It can be exhausting work. I mean, you definitely have to have your outlets and releases. And the type of people I think who do best in social work are people who can have a level of detachment from the work.
Yeah.
You can't take everything in.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask you that, like, because it's a lot of heavy stuff. How do you remove, what I mean? How do you remove yourself, from taking all of that on,
Yeah, you definitely have to have outlets, people who you can talk to, co-workers who you can talk through situations with. But some of the stories, I mean, they stick with you. Some of the experiences, they stick.
Wow. Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, wow. This is heavy stuff. This is heavy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I do think that it helps to be able to, I mean, if you're, for example, me being a clinical social worker and I'm doing therapy, if I have a client who comes in my office and they're telling me a story and they're crying, I'm not going to be in here like bawling all over my office table. You have to be able to keep yourself together and detach from it to some degree. But sometimes, again, the stories are so compelling, you can't help but do anything.
Right.
So, and I tell social workers and therapists all the time, it's okay to cry if you feel like you need to do that. I mean, I do that sometimes, but again, I try to use discretion on the times when I do it, because, there's this way that sometimes when a client comes into your office, they can kind of sense your personality. And if they need to start caring for you, sometimes we call those people empathic or empaths, or, they just have a really good awareness around other people's emotions. So if you're working with someone like that, then you definitely have to be careful as a social worker that you're not having that person care for you in the session.
Yes, those empaths, I think.
Yes, yeah.
And so, we talk about, the heaviness of it, not having to take it on. Mm-hmm. So what advice can you give to, someone who may be interested? They think this is the field for them. They think they can handle it. What advice would you offer them?
Yeah. So I would say start with your values and know that you don't have to do the heavy work. If you don't want to do heavy work, you don't have to do heavy work. Just how I mentioned before, there's the micro, meso, and macro level. If you choose you want to work in an after-school program with youth doing crafts and helping them with social skill development, you can absolutely do that. If you want to do dance therapy and use dance as a mechanism to help people remove trauma from the body, you can do that. If you want to create curriculums for children who are experiencing a divorce or children whose family separated, you could do that. If you want to work at a governmental level, work behind a desk processing paperwork for disability claims or Social Security, you can do that too. So you really have to know that the field is so broad, you don't have to do the heavy work. You can work on any other level in the profession. And for example, one of the other positions that I worked in when I worked in higher ed, that wasn't a very heavy position. So I worked at a college and I taught as a social work instructor. That's something else that a social worker can do. And I also worked in alumni relations before. So that was working with the graduates of a particular university and helping them to re-engage with the university by planning events and activities such as homecoming, traveling, and getting donors to donate back to the university. So you can do that with the social work degree. So one is just know that the field is so broad, you don't have to do the heavy work. And then two, again, know your values, meaning know the things that you perceive in your own being as good, bad, right, wrong, fair and unfair, just and unjust, okay and not okay. Those are the things that are going to drive your passion, because you're going to have a strong conviction around the things that you believe to be okay, not okay, acceptable, unacceptable, right and wrong. And wherever that passion comes from, where you say, that's not right, people shouldn't do that, you shouldn't treat people like that, everybody should have access to that. Those are your values. So you want to find work, you want to write all your values down. What are those things you consider to be good, fair, right and wrong, just, unjust, okay and not okay? Define what those are for you, and then try to find a position that falls in line with the values that you have. So that's one of the pieces of advice that I would give someone who's wanting to be in the profession. Don't do work that is not aligned with your values.
Thank you for those awesome points. Firstly, know yourself.
Absolutely.
Know your values.
Yes.
And make sure that that aligns with what you believe in.
Yes.
And then secondly, you talk about having an understanding that it's a broad area. If you believe this is the field for you, there's levels to it.
Yes.
You don't have to just be in one particular area. You can start off at one level, move on to the next level. It's a broad career.
Absolutely.
And so thank you for sharing that awesome advice.
Yeah.
And so the importance, we came off of the heels of Black History Month, and you talk about we have those different issues in our community, because you talk about the broad social work organization, and then there being a separate social work organization for African Americans.
Yes.
So let's talk about the importance of social work in our communities. And so why is it important that as it pertains to our communities, social work in our communities? I heard you talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, well, I think if families and communities understood the role that social workers could play, I don't think they would feel so isolated. I don't think they would feel as if they had to manage and handle things on their own. They wouldn't have to carry the burden of feeling as if they didn't have any help. I think sometimes people have to get over this whole idea of I have to do all the things by myself. No one can help me. I have to manage it all. If I don't do it, it's not going to get done right. So once people can overcome that and really accept the help, then I think that they can see that social workers could be an added addition to really help you begin figuring things out and kind of putting the pieces of your life together. Now, the disadvantage of that is social workers are mandated reporters. And that's part of the reason why people don't like having social workers around, because a mandated reporter means if there's any suspicion of abuse or neglect of a family member, elderly person, or any vulnerable person, that we're mandated to report that to Children's Services or to developmental disabilities or to the population that works with the aging and elderly. So in that regard, if people feel as if when they're so stressed, then maybe they become aggressive or physical or they cuss, they might not want someone who's going to report them around. So even though we are a helping profession, we still have standards and expectations around how do you handle this stress? How do you manage that? Even though you're angry, do you need to be slapping somebody? Do you need to be hemming them up against a wall? Do you need to give them a whooping? So now we're not the police, we're not policing how you do things, but we do want people to take a closer look at how they're handling themselves and how they're handling children and other vulnerable people around them to ensure that they're not putting those people in jeopardy of trauma or further trauma. So that can be the benefit of having social workers around for our community. but oftentimes because within our community, we do resort to physical violence sometimes, or we do whoop our children, or we do cuss at our children. You know, sometimes just the way that we operate is like, no, I'd rather not. So that could be the dilemma.
Thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned something, and you mentioned something as it pertains to, our communities. And I wanted to ask you, do you think there's a stigma attached that people just want to be like, I just don't want to bother? Do you think there's a stigma attached to social work?
Absolutely. Yeah. A lot of people think that social workers are nosy, that we are in your business, that we want to take your kids, that, that we want to tell you how to be a parent. We want to tell you how to spend your money. So, yeah, there's a stigma attached to it. And if you don't want someone to be there to help or to have a level of accountability with the things that you're doing, it can feel intrusive. It can feel like you might not be ready for the help that is being offered, or sometimes you didn't ask for it. Depending on the situation, sometimes you're mandated to have to work with a social worker. So it just depends on, what's going on with your family and with your situation. But there's absolutely a negative stigma attached to it. And again, but that's only at the micro level. That's only the level of social work when you're working directly with people. Some people don't even know, like if you have a family member who is in hospice and you need to make a decision about their end of life care, you can have a social worker around who can help with that decision. Now that would be a less intrusive way that a social worker can help you. But if you don't know that our role is there to do that, then you wouldn't even know to ask for it. Or if you're admitted into the hospital, or if you have a family member who's admitted into the hospital because they're experiencing some type of psychosis or a mental health issue, and you need a social worker there to advocate for you in terms of the stay, how long you can stay at the hospital, or what your aftercare is going to be once you leave the hospital, then you would have a social worker there who would help you make those decisions for your family member. So again, that would be less intrusive.
Thank you. Thank you for enlightening us. And so I want to ask if you have any additional comments as we wind down to our session. Do you have any additional comments you would like to add?
Well, I will say this. I would encourage people to continue to think broadly about the social work profession. And because I've shared this with you, if a friend or family member tells you that they're interested in the social work profession, try to remember how broad it is without being discouraging. Because sometimes I hear a lot of new social workers say, I told my mom or I told my sister that I wanted to be a social worker. And it was like, it's no money in that, or what you want to take people's children for. So don't allow your bias around what you think the social work profession is to impact someone else's ability to do the work. Because it can be discouraging for someone who's ready to start if you don't have all the information about what the profession entails.
Definitely, it can definitely be discouraging for someone who may be thinking about going into it, and for the heavy load. I want to say the heavy load, that you have to carry is the pay, really equal to I don't know, and that may be discouraging because persons may feel as though they don't make the money that you would want to make. That's not a profession that you would want to go into.
Absolutely. And I think that's a fair decision. If you have a certain amount of money, you have to look at the level of work that's going to be required. And if you don't want to do that work for that level of work, then you don't take the position. But know that, again, if you start in alumni relations, you could start significantly higher than what you might make working in direct practice. Or if you were to work on increasing your therapy skills, you could work at a level to where you could set your own salary. You can decide how much you want to make if you're able to open your own practice. Or if you were to drill down on a specific area of expertise, like grief or loss or prenatal care, and you were to become an expert in that, people can seek you out as a speaker for your level of expertise, or you can write a book, or you can provide resources to people who need it. So there's no cap on your income once you have a certain level of skills. So if you don't want to do that work, then you have to have a skill that can support you where people will want to pay you for what you know.
Thank you. Thank you for enlightening us today. I mean, I learned a lot. I learned a lot, and learning a lot about, you know, the social work profession. And I'm glad that, you know, this month is kind of put aside to really highlight the profession. And it's so important, and it's particularly important within our communities, vulnerable communities.
Absolutely.
This profession is very important, and what you do is very important as well, as you highlight Afrocentric. I don't know if you want to touch just a little bit on the difference as it pertains to Afrocentric.
Absolutely. So Afrocentricity is a term that I learned it from Malefe K. Asante. He has a book called Afrocentricity, and it's a social service framework or social theory of dealing with problems centered within the African American community. So what Afrocentricity is a model that can be used in how we understand problems as African Americans. So traditionally, when we learn of a problem or we know of a problem, it's oftentimes we learn about it based off of how another culture is experiencing the problem. So with Afrocentricity, what that seeks to do, So not even necessarily a problem, just how we learn in general. So when we learn about beauty standards, the standards that we learn about beauty are specific to a certain culture. Meaning a slender nose, certain features, a certain body size. That's how we actually got the body mass index, was off of a certain body type. So what Afrocentricity does is it begins to decenter whiteness, and it centers African and African descendant people. Meaning, what would our lives be like if we weren't living on the peripheral of our lives, meaning the outskirts of our lives, but we were in the center, and we made decisions from the center because we're the authors, and we're the ones who are identifiers with the culture. So we're the ones who can say what a beauty standard is, what parenting looks like, what marriage should look like, if marriage should be a part of the home, how do we parent our children? So once we center ourselves and we're not operating on the outside or peripheral of our lives, we make decisions differently. We make decisions at the communal level because we are a communal people, and not at the individual level where we're more so thinking about ourselves and what we have to benefit or what we have to offer. So it's just a way of recentering ourselves.
Thank you, Manicka.
Yeah.
Thank you for enlightening us and sharing. You know, as I hear you speak, I can hear your passion, you know, for your field.
Yeah. Yeah, I love it. I've been doing it for a long time. So yeah.
Awesome. You know, to see a Black young person, you know, qualified in this field and qualified in doing what you do is very important as well. So I want to thank you for taking the time out to share with us today. And I truly appreciate you for, you know, just being here and sharing your passion and talking about your field with us today.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for the invite. I really appreciate this. I just appreciate you for thinking about recognizing Social Work Month.
Definitely. I mean, you're doing a lot of good things, and this field is so very important. It's so very, very vital to talk about.
Yeah, thank you again.
All right. So would you like to share your page?
Sure. So if anyone wants to get in touch with me, you can find me on Instagram or Facebook or LinkedIn under my name, Manicka Thomas. Or if you're interested in getting information about careers in social work or book lists that I recommend to new social workers, you can go to my website, which is ManickaThomas.com.
Thank you, Manicka.
Absolutely.
So as we observe, this month of March is standing observance of Social Work Month. And again, we just can't really say, you know, how much effort, how much strength it takes to really, someone who really has their heart in this field, how much strength it takes to really be here and really taking the load off of other persons and taking it on and, you know, really working in this field. It's a lot.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing your heart with us today.
Thank you.
And so with that, we've come to the end of our session. Comment under our videos. Let us know your thoughts. You can follow us, subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you'll see our different social handles on our page. So I want to thank you for those who are listening in. Lynetta Weaver, thank you so much for commenting. So with that, we've come to the end of our session. And Can We Talk? Thank you so much.